All right, so we talked about responsive units. Responsive units are units in our design that can, respond or change. Things like percentages, things like REMs or, responsive M units. The next of the two things that we're going to talk about is responsive media. Okay. Now, what does that mean? Well, I'm going to show you guys an example. This is exercise 3. And I have this example, HTML file called break example. Okay. And what's going on here is there's a div. And I gave it a background color and I gave it a width. Okay. So at the moment, what's going on is this div is 75% of the page. That's what we wrote here, right? So what I'm going to do is keep making this a little bit smaller. Okay. I'll make smaller and a little bit smaller. And I might even put a little padding on it just so it's easier to see. And then see what's happening here. Okay, so what's actually happening is my image is breaking out of the div that it's inside of. Okay. So why is that happening? Why are we getting a situation like this? Well, let's think about this. This is 75% of the page, right? Now, what I'm going to do is preview this. And you can we can actually figure out how big this is. So if I did an inspect here, and if I actually click on this div, actually, if I click on the body, it'll actually tell me how wide this page is. So it's 1424. And if I, this is the literal size here. So I'm going to make this 1400 pixels. Okay. Now the width of the page keeps changing. And this is always going to be 3/4 of whatever this width of the page is, right? And I also have this image. Okay. The image itself has a finite size, meaning it cannot be smaller, but can it not be bigger than the width here, which, oops, I think it says it, but it's blocking it. There it is. The width here is 650. Okay. So even as my page gets smaller, this remains 650. Eventually, what's going to happen is this stays 650, the image itself, and the container becomes less than 650. In fact, let's look at this right now. The div, if we actually click on it, the div is 609. Okay, which is smaller than 650. So what happens is, well, there's not enough space, so this busts out. Okay. So that's, not really what we want. We don't want our media to become bigger than the images to become bigger than the container they're in. Okay. So what can I do? Well, I could try to maybe, resize this, give it a smaller or bigger width. But there's actually a very easy way to solve this. Okay. Now, we've talked a lot about width, the width property. Okay. So let's say I'm going to select this image and I could give it a width, 700 pixels, right? And what I'm doing is I'm giving the image a width. If I change this value, okay, I can resize it, right? Not only can I do that, I can also do this as a percentage. So what if I said, well, let's make the image 50%. Well, 50% of what? Well, 50% of the container that it's in. So this is the container. The width is going to be 50% of this. So as the image gets bigger or smaller, this resizes, okay? So we're kind of on the right track, except I don't always want the image to grow. I only really want it to, I don't want it to get bigger. I really only want the image to get smaller. Like I don't want it to go beyond a certain size. So what I could do is we could set what's called a max width. And I could set that max width to an exact amount. I can say, well, the image is going to be 50%, but it can't be above a certain size, like maybe 700 pixels. Okay. So what's going to happen in this case? Actually, I probably can't get it. Let's make it like 400. What's going to happen is the image can shrink, but it can't get bigger than this dimension. Not only that, you can also do a min width too. I could say it has to be a minimum of a certain amount. But what I'm going to do to fix this problem is I want the image to stay the size that it is. But what I'm going to do is say, well, max width 100%. Okay. So what this means is that there's not a minimum width there. So the image is allowed to, doesn't have to get bigger. But if this ever becomes smaller than the image itself, because the maximum width can't be more than the size of the container that it's in, if the container becomes smaller than the image, then the image is going to have to shrink. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So when the container is bigger than the image is not resized. But as soon as the image becomes, excuse me, smaller than, oops, except I didn't save it. Let's save that bad boy. Okay, see how the image now shrinks. All right, so let's see this in a more kind of professional setting. Here I have an exercise 3. I have this container. And I have these images here. So what you might happen is you might have some images like here where the images are actually getting cut off, right? So the images, I'm not seeing the full width because the page itself is actually becoming smaller. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a little class here called responsive. And I'm going to say max width 100%. I'm going to apply this to my image. So let's get that image. Okay. So now that I've applied this, this image is not allowed to be smaller than the page itself, because the page, you know, what is happening essentially is this is causing this to get smaller. This causes this to get smaller because this is 100%. This, you know, what we're saying is this cannot be 100% more than, it can't be bigger than 100% of this. This can't be bigger than 100% of this. So as the page itself gets smaller, which is the body, so does the image. Okay. You can actually see this in most designs. So if I go to something like, say, CNN, as the page actually widens here, you can actually see the images getting a little bit wider, right? You guys see that? You can see it here. Let's look at a different website. This is probably not the best page for it, but see if I can find a page with a lot. So this image here, see how it's responding. It's not being allowed to be smaller than the size of the page. Okay. So I'm going to go through, let's do the same thing to these images. So responsive. Okay, so these images. Now, the same thing actually happens with other media like videos and audio like images. They have a preset width, okay? So images have a built-in width, like for all of these images, there is a dimensions to it. Oops, what happened? So there's the dimensions of this, dimensions of that one, right? This video, I have a video here, and this video actually has its own dimensions. It's actually set to about a width of 550, okay? And what I'm going to do is eventually what happens is the video becomes bigger than the container that it's in. Like with this, I also want it to resize. So I would apply that same effect of having the responsiveness to it. So I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to add that class equals responsive. Okay, save. And so now the video will respond just like the images did. Okay, so this is a nice, easy way to make things like videos and images resize themselves. So they're never going to accidentally break out of a container. Okay.